We are going to learn watercolor skill builders here, watercolor paint techniques. There are a ton more I can show you, but we have to kind of keep it focused. So these are the ones I chose for your class. So we'll start here at the top. This is a wet on wet technique. So for that you're going to need some clean water and a clean brush, and you want to get the paper wet with the water. So put the water on the paper with no paint. And then you get your watercolor paints and you put wet paint on the wet paper, and that's why we call it a wet on wet technique. So you want to puddle up some of that paint and just lay it onto the paper, and you'll see once it touches the paper it'll start to kind of move because all that water is going to provide movement. If you have too much water, you can blot some of it up with a paper towel, but the fun part of wet on wet is kind of seeing where it goes, and you can control it a little bit depending on how much water you use. Now I like to use multiple colors when I'm doing this technique, so you can kind of see how the colors work together, and it's a soft fuzzy effect. Now mine is puddling up in the middle there, so what you can do is just dab it with a paper towel like I said, or dry off your brush really thoroughly, and with a dry brush you can just soak up some of that water. Lay the brush right on it and it soaks into the brush. Okay, next up is a graded wash. So the goal of this is basically like a value scale. You want to go dark to light, and that is all going to happen with the amount of water that you use. So to start off darker, you want less water on your brush, more paint. And then as you move up, you will remove the amount of paint and more water will be on your brush. So I'm starting at the bottom and I am just layering a few coats of paint. So this part is my darkest part. Notice I'm not mixing it with any other color though. It's just you want the most vibrant version of that color, and then you lighten up as you go to the top. So I'm going to paint this as bright as I can make it, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse my brush to remove some of that paint, and then therefore my brush is getting more water on it. And then I'm going to like layer it a little bit into the color and then start moving up with it, and it should technically begin lightening up on itself. And then as you keep moving with this, you do that same process. Take more paint out, more water in the brush. And then you can use that brush to smooth it all out at the end. Next will be dry brush. So you do want to make sure your brush is dry. I'm using a paper towel to dry mine off. You can use that or a sponge. And you want to dip your dry brush into the paint. Now, it can't be too dry that it's not going to activate the paint, but it has to be mostly dry. And then you're going to use that dry brush to paint, and the goal is for it to look kind of like scrapes across the paper. So if it looks like too pretty and smooth, you have too much water on your brush. You got to dry it off more. Next we have resist. So this one you're going to need a crayon or an oil pastel. And I want you to draw a design or a picture in this little box with that crayon or oil pastel. And maybe try a variety of colors with your media. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take watercolor paint and you're going to paint right on top of this, and you will realize that oil and water don't mix. So when you put paint on top of the oil pastel, it's just gonna stay there. It like repels the water. So this is a really cool effect to combine a little bit of drawing and painting together with a nice oil pastel resist. You're going to get more contrast if you choose contrasting colors, like a warm and a cool color. So like the warm color paint with the cool color oil pastel. Like the orange paint with the orange flower isn't a lot of contrast, so you're not seeing a lot of how this truly works. So next I'm going to do lines, and for lines you really want to use a smaller brush, and you just want to put paint on the tippy toe of that brush. So you don't need a ton of water. You want to control the water that you're using. And dip your brush in the paint And then with control, you want to make the thinnest lines you can possibly make. So notice how I'm putting just the tippy toe of my brush in the paint there. And the reason we're doing this is to practice our control, because a lot of times with watercolor paint, it can move freely and we can kind of move more organically with it. But sometimes we do have to stop and control it to get into some crisper edges and stuff like that, or little textures. So as thin as you can make it with a small paintbrush is what I want you to do here for the lines part. Next is wet on dry. So this is a little different than the wet on wet at the beginning there. So wet on dry means you're going to be using wet paint onto dry paper. So it's just sort of basic painting. Where wet on wet was the wet paper with the wet paint, wet on dry, dry paper, wet paint. By keeping the paper dry, you have a little bit more control over the paints because the water is not there to help the paint move around like it is on the wet on wet technique. So that's sort of the benefit. Obviously, if you use a lot of water within your paints, it has the freedom to move about. But technically, you should have some more control with a wet on dry technique. All right, and then next we're going to do color bleed. So color bleed is kind of like a wet on wet, but you're not getting the paper wet to begin with. You are doing a wet on dry, but you're doing it and you lay like two colors next to one another, and then the color before it mixes with the new color and it tends to just move into one another. So you'll be able to see it here a little bit better with the lighter color. As I touch that orange, see how the orange bleeds into the yellow. That's a color bleed. And you can control it or just let it go naturally as I'm doing here. So with a color bleed, they look so cool naturally, so I wouldn't overwork it. I think I'm overworking it a little too much here. I should have just left it because it looked a lot neater that way. But that's a color bleed. That's how you do that. All right, and next we have splatter paint. So splatter is super fun, but it is unpredictable. So it's best to have control here. Warn your table mates if you're going to splatter. So what you do is you tap the top of your paintbrush. You have a wet paint in your brush, and you just do gentle taps on top of the brush. Keep the brush kind of close to the paper so it's not going everywhere. What you'll notice though is like it is uncontrollable. So some of my splatter marks got outside of my box. Some of my splatter marks are larger than others. So this all depends on the effect you're going for and whether or not this is a good technique for you to use for your piece. The last one here is drip. So this one you do want to get a decent amount of water with some paint, and you're going to create like just a bead of paint at the top of your section. You definitely want to make sure you have enough water. If you don't have enough water, this effect doesn't work at all. Okay, once you feel it's good, you tilt your paper. You might have to tap your paper on the surface of the table, and then it drips. It falls down. Again, this depends on what you're creating, but this could be a nice effect, but it is also unpredictable, just like the splatter. You're not quite sure how those drips are going to land if you do that technique. Okay, here are the watercolor paint techniques we are learning for this class.